Chapter 7 Immanence. The commitment to immanence declares itself most powerfully, to be sure, in Hegel's wholesale attack on ethics, particularly of the Kantian variety. It is important to distinguish the technical German term for this philosophical subfield, Moralität or morality, from the associations of the word Sittlichkeit, which conveys the collective values or mores, sitten, of an historical group or period, and which counts for Hegel as Geist or spirit, rather than as mere individual ethics. We have already touched on moments in which Hegel puts the soul in or ethical imperative through its philosophical paces and demonstrates its contradictions, for example, that between nature and duty, conceived of by Kant as unmotivated and as non-pleasurable, for even the pleasure that might be taken in fulfilling one's duty makes of the latter an interested act, and therefore not yet a fully ethical, that is to say, disinterested one. Yet morality is meant to bring about some ultimate unity or harmony between nature and the ethical subject. But the consummation of this progress has to be projected into a future infinitely remote, for if it actually came about, this would do away with the moral consciousness. For morality is only moral consciousness as negative essence, for whose pure duty sensuousness has only a negative significance, is only not in conformity with duty. But in that harmony, morality qua consciousness, i.e. its actuality, vanishes, just as in the moral consciousness, or in the actuality of morality, the harmony vanishes. The consummation, therefore, cannot be attained, but is to be thought of merely as an absolute task, i.e. one which simply remains a task. 446-447/368, the dilemma has some resemblance to another, more passionate or existential one, namely that of the so-called law of the heart, where the solitary hero, in other words, Jean-Jacques, pits the authenticity of his own private love and passion against the whole outside world, a reality which is, on the one hand a law by which the particular individuality is oppressed, a violent ordering of the world which contradicts the law of the heart, and on the other hand, a humanity suffering. Under that ordering, a humanity that does not follow the law of the heart, but is subjected to an alien necessity. 275/221, the individual then seeks the liberation of this humanity from its alienation, seeks to establish the law of the heart as a universal law, at which point his own individuality vanishes, and his passion degenerates into what Hegel ventures to call an inner perversion of itself, a deranged consciousness which finds that its essential being is immediately non-essential, its reality immediately an unreality. The heart-throb for the welfare of humanity therefore passes into the ravings of an insane self-conceit, into the fury of consciousness to preserve itself from destruction. 280/225-226, the immediate reference is clearly the agony of Rousseau in Rousseau judged Jean-Jacques, in which philanthropy and paranoia meet in a desperate dialectical unity. In both instances, then, an individual ethos meets the otherness of collectivity or the world, and founders on the impossible contradiction of the very notion of law, recapitulating that earlier dialectic of the inner laws of nature, of force or essence and its distinction from appearance. Law is a desperate attempt of the stand to think immanence by separating its moments, inside from outside, before from after, cause from effect, possibility from actuality. Indeed, the word actuality, an English translation more pointed and useful than its German equivalent Wirklichkeit or reality as such, is a whole Hegelian program here, and we can best approach the Hegelian doctrine of immanence by understanding that for Hegel actuality already includes its own possibilities and potentialities. They are not something separate and distinct from it, lying in some other alternate world or in the future. Qua possibility, this promise of the real is already here and not simply possible. This dialectic, worked out elaborately in the logic, lies at the very heart of Hegel's realism, in politics and in history alike. It is also the other face of the Hegelian doctrine of necessity, about which he says that philosophy is its study, but of which he also sometimes seems to offer a retrospective view, the owl of Minerva famously taking its flight at dusk, yet insisting that philosophy only has to do with what is 29. Yet all of these observations would seem to exclude the future, and in one way or another to stage reality as a temporal present in which there can be no conception of radical change. This would indeed be a paradoxical outcome for dialectical philosophy, but Hegel's essential conservatism, his alleged defense of the Prussian status quo, has often been plausibly argued, and even if it can be disproven, the refutation would also have to be accompanied by some persuasive demonstration of the ways in which Hegelian immanence can be said to energize a revolutionary frame of mind rather than discourage it and strengthen a kind of disempowered apathy, what he himself might have called listlessness, the listless movement of spirit which no longer creates a distinction within itself. 424/349. Yet what else can be expected from the famous slogan, what is real is rational and what is rational is real, certainly a far better characterization of the spirit of Hegelianism than the old tripartite formula. An apocryphal story has the student Heinrich Heine approaching the master at the end of a lecture and impertinently asking him whether this formula was not a rather conservative one. Hegel is supposed to have looked down his nose at the upstart and to have observed, as you are obviously a clever young man, to you alone I will reveal the secret meaning, namely, that the real must become rational, and the rational must become real. Indeed, it is in this sense that the left has always understood Hegel's doctrine, thus reinforcing the political ambiguity of his work in general and raising once again the issue of temporality and that of the compatibility of historical change with Hegel's doctrine of immanence. If the real must become rational, then we are apparently back in the world of Kant's ethical imperatives, and all of Hegel's severest strictures fall back on his own positions. In fact, in this reading of Hegel, one affirmed by Marx himself in his own doctrine, the future is already present within the present of time, the present is already imminently the future it ought to have. Historical change exists, but it is systemic change. It is the movement between the great Hegelian shapes or Gestalten, which foreshadow later structural conceptions of the social totality, of epistemes or even modes of production. This is not to say that such a notion of totality does not remain ambiguous, for the affirmation of the future already latent in the present can mean on the one hand that the future is already here, but waiting within the present as the statue waits to be disengaged from the sculptor's block of marble, or it can simply mean that whatever future is already present in the unsubstantial subjective form of wishes and longings, never to be realized insofar as the future never comes. No one can rescue Hegelianism from profound structural ambiguities of this kind, which are clearly indissociable from the unity of opposites. But an emphasis on the ethos of work and activity will at least tend to weigh it in the direction of praxis, as a striking moment in Hegel's early discussion of the religious world, in the section on the unhappy consciousness, makes dramatically clear. Hegel is discussing the internal divisions of medieval real life, where consciousness merely finds itself desiring and working. It is not aware that to find itself active in this way implies that it is in fact certain of itself, and that its feeling of the alien existence is this self-feeling. 170, 132. There follows an extraordinary outburst, in which Hegel affirms that the reality of praxis outweighs any religious ignorance or repression of it, the fact that the unchangeable consciousness renounces and surrenders its embodied form, while, on the other hand, the particular individual consciousness gives thanks for the gift, i.e. denies itself the satisfaction of being conscious of its independence, and assigns the essence of its action not to itself but to the beyond. Through these two moments of reciprocal self-surrender of both parts, consciousness does, of course, gain a sense of its unity with the unchangeable. But this unity is at the same time affected with division, is again broken within itself, and from it there emerges once more the antithesis of the universal and the individual. For though consciousness renounces the show of satisfying its feeling of self, it obtains the actual satisfaction of it, for it has been desire, work, and enjoyment, as consciousness it has willed, acted, and enjoyed. Similarly, even its giving of thanks, in which it acknowledges the other extreme as the essential being and counts itself nothing, is its own act which counterbalances the action of the other extreme, and meets the self-sacrificing beneficence with a like action. If the other extreme delivers over to consciousness only the surface of its being, yet consciousness also gives thanks, and in surrendering its own action, i.e. its essential being, it really does more than the other which only sheds a superficial element of itself. Thus the entire movement is reflected not only in the actual desiring, working, and enjoyment, but even in the very giving of thanks where the reverse seems to take place, in the extreme of individuality. Consciousness feels itself therein as this particular individual, and does not let itself be deceived by its own seeming renunciation, for the truth of the matter is that it has not renounced itself. What has been brought about is only the double reflection into the two extremes, and the result is the renewed division into the opposed consciousness of the unchangeable, and the consciousness of willing, performing, and enjoying, and self-renunciation itself which confronts it, in other words, the consciousness of independent individuality in general. 134 to 135. Dafür das Unwandelbar Bewusstsein auf sein Gestalt Verzichtung sie preisgibt, Desigen das Einzelne Bewusstsein dankt, die Befriedigung des Bewusstseins seiner selbst und gibt sich Verzeihtung das Wissen des Tons von sich abdem Gensitz zuweist, durch dies bei den Moment des Gegensatigen sich Ortsgebens beide Talentstedt higher mit allerdings dem Bewusstsein sein Einheit mit dem Unwandelbaren. Allein sogleich ist diese Einheit mit der Trennung affisiert, in sich wieder gebrochen, des tritt USI der Gegensatz des Allgemeinen und Einzelnen wieder hervor. Denn das Bewusstsein entsagt Swasumskein der Befriedigung seines Selbstgefalls, allein aber die wirkliche Befriedigung desselben, denn es ist begehrt, Arbeitung genufiduesen, es hat als Bewusstsein gewollt, Getten und Genesen. Sein Danken ebenso, worin es das andere Extrem als das Wissen Anerkennung sich aufhebt, ist selbst sein eigens Tan, welches das Tan des anderen Extrems aufwiegt und der sich preisgebenden wollt hat ein gleiches Tan entgegenstellt, wenn gens ihm sein Oberfilch, Eibelefit, so dankt es aber auch und tagt darin, in dem es sein Tan, die ich sein Wissen selbst aufgibt, eigentlich mehr als das andere, das nur ein Oberfläche von sich abstoffet. Die ganz Bewegung reflektiert sich also nicht nur im wirklichen Begehren, Arbeiten und Genefin, sondern sogar selbst im Danken, worin das Gegenteil zu Geststellenskind, in das Extrem der Einzelheit. Das Bewusstsein fällt sich darin als dieses Einzeln und läuft sich durch den Skin seins Versich deistens nicht toschen, denn die Wort desselben ist, dafür es sich nicht aufgegeben hat, was es dann die gekommen, ist nur die gedoppelt Reflection in die beiden Extrem, und das Resultat ist, die Wiederholspaltung in das entgegengesetzte Bewusstsein des Unwandelbaren und in das Bewusstsein des Gegeneibsten Wollens, wo übrigens, Genefins und des auf sich Versich deistens selbst oder der Versichseienden Einzelheit überhaupt. 172 to 173.